Hello, my name is Gregory Dowling, and the subject of this short talk is Giacomo Casanova, the most famous Venetian. I hope this is going to be the first of a series of talks on subjects that I'm particularly interested in, many of them connected with the city of Venice, where I have lived now for over 40 years, its customs, its characters, its literature. It's currently carnival here in Venice, and so the streets are full of people dressed as very often in 18th century costumes, because that is the century that we most closely associate with the spirit of Venetian carnival. And so it seems fitting to give a talk on the man who is sometimes thought of as embodying the spirit of Venetian carnival, Giacomo Casanova. Last year, 2025, was, of course, the tricentenary of Casanova's birth. And there were a number of conferences, celebrations, commemorations of this figure. And towards the end of the year, in November, we held a literary festival, specifically a festival devoted to crime fiction entitled Venice Noir. And the second panel of this festival was devoted to the figure of Casanova. So we held a trial of Giacomo Casanova. There were 4 authors involved in this trial. David Hewson, the crime novelist, played the part of the prosecutor. Lisa Hilton, the novelist and historian, defended Casanova. Anna Mazzola, who is, as well as being an author, a lawyer herself, acted as an expert witness, and I tried to remain neutral as the judge, guiding the jury and leading them to their verdict. The jury consisted of the audience for this panel, and I have to say that the audience found Casanova guilty. Guilty of what? Well, essentially, I suppose, the main accusation against him was that of sexual abuse. Leaving aside the question of how possible it is to conduct a trial of somebody who lived 3 centuries ago, what was interesting was to discover how little many people knew about Casanova. I'm not talking about the 4 authors involved in this trial. I'm talking about some of the people in the general public whom I talked to. Everybody, of course, knew the name Casanova, but very often little beyond the fact that he was supposed to have been a great lover. And there were even some who weren't sure whether he was a real person or not. And so I've decided to make this video as a brief introduction, and particularly to give the context in which the phenomenon of Casanova arose. So as I say, 2025 was the tricentenary of his death. It followed closely upon a series of bicentenaries, the bicentenaries of the great poets of the second generation of Romantics, who all died within a few years of each other. John Keats in 1821, Percy Bysshe Shelley in 1822, and Lord Byron in 1824. And as a teacher of literature, and somebody who lives in Italy, there being a connection of all of these 3 authors with Italy, I was closely involved with some of these celebrations, commemorations. And of course, there was no need to explain to anybody why we considered it important to celebrate these people. They're all great writers. They've contributed to our great heritage of English literature. Casanova, of course, is a little different. For most people, as I say, he's just a name, the great lover. Some who know a little bit more think of him as the libertine, a swaggering libertine, a gambler, a man who proudly declared that cultivating the pleasure of my senses was, throughout my life, ma principale affaire, my main business. I never had a more important one. So, is he really worth our serious attention? Well, I think the main answer is that his life is extremely interesting. Casanova went everywhere. He seems to have met everyone of note in Europe in the 18th century. So even if you're not interested in Casanova himself, or you don't approve of him, he does throw in his memoirs interesting sidelights on some of these major figures. He met, now just thinking of rulers, he met Louis XV, he met Frederick the Great, Empress Catherine, the King of Poland, Pope Clement XIII, Madame de Pompadour. Thinking of writers, he talks about encounters with Voltaire, with Rousseau, with Benjamin Franklin, with his fellow Venetian citizen Carlo Goldoni, with the librettist Metastasio and Da Ponte. He met famous painters such as Mengs, Rosalba Carriera, Jean-Baptiste Creuse. And of course, he met a number of the famous adventurers of the century, Count Cagliostro, Comte de Saint-Germain, and a series of alchemists, occultists, professional duelists, people very similar in many ways to Casanova himself. And then, of course, he met a host of lesser-known people, some people that we only know about through his memoirs, but whom he brings brilliantly to life. As you might say, he brings to life the century in which he lived. So let me begin by declaring how I first began to get interested in Casanova. And essentially it was as a writer. I wanted to write a novel set in 18th century Venice. I had toyed with the idea of writing a historical novel set in an earlier period, such as the Secolo d'Oro, the great golden century of Venice, the 16th century. But it was too much of a challenge for me. I didn't feel that I could enter into the mindset of people of that period. But I felt that I could do so with the century of the Enlightenment. And it's proved much easier to find out what 18th century Venetians thought, felt, and believed than it was with Venetians of earlier ages. We have a great deal of information about this. We have letters, we have memoirs, we have plays. In particular, we have the memoirs of Casanova. In fact, it could be said that it's not until the 18th century that we really have any great Venetian literature. Venice, of course, was a major producer of great art in other fields, great paintings, sculpture, architecture, music, but we have to wait until the 18th century to find great literature and famous writers. The first of these writers is the playwright Carlo Goldoni. Venice is probably one of Italy's greatest playwrights, whose works are still performed today, and not only in Italy. And the second is Casanova himself, though probably Casanova is the first in terms of sheer fame, as a name, as a legend. In that sense, he certainly outstrips Goldoni. Here are just a few examples of Casanova in films, which we might think of as the great art form of the 20th and 21st century. And they range from the serious to the frivolous, from the romantic to the pretentious. So, hence the title of my talk, The Most Famous Venetian of All, even though I did add a question mark. Maybe Marco Polo is another contender for that title. But really, there's not that much competition. There were, of course, many great Venetians before Casanova. Soldiers, statesmen, painters, architects, composers, great navigators. But none of them is in the same league in terms of sheer fame, or perhaps, more to the point, sheer notoriety. There are very few Venetians who have become household names. If we think in terms of the rulers, Venice doesn't have the great indigenous names that have become legendary, like, for example, the Medici in Florence, or the Visconti in Milan, or here perhaps we're talking of notoriety again, the Borgias in Rome. There are the great surnames of the Venetian ruling classes, like the Foscari, the Mocenigo, and the Loredan, but to most people, these names evoke palaces rather than people. Here, for example, is Ca' Foscari on the Grand Canal, now the home of the seat of the Venice University. Here are the Palazzi Mocenigo on the Grand Canal. And these are really famous today because Byron lived there at the beginning of the 19th century, rather than the Mocenigo themselves. And then there's Ca' Loredan, again, on the Grand Canal. And if we do associate a face to a name, like for example, Doge Loredan, it's the painter Bellini we think of and not the historical figure. And this is a painting in the National Gallery in London. And the same, I would say, is true for the great captains or condottieri of Venice. For example, Colleoni, Bartolomeo Colleoni, is far more famous as a statue than as a warrior. Okay, this is the statue by Verrocchio that stands outside the church of Santi Giovanni e Paolo. Even the great Venetian artists are less distinct to us than their Florentine or Roman peers. Because unless we're art historians, we know less about the personality of Titian, for example, than we do of Michelangelo or Leonardo. Of course, the facts of Titian's life are documented and they're available to historians and biographers, but they haven't become part of the collective imagination. No one has ever thought of making a film of Titian's life with Charlton Heston, as was done with Michelangelo. And no one has thought of writing a thriller or making a film with the title The Vecellio Code, Vecellio being Titian's surname. And I'm thinking here, of course, of the Da Vinci Code. Now, the reason for this is closely connected to the rigid political and cultural system of Venice, the aim of which was specifically to prevent anyone or any family from becoming too famous. So if we think of the doges of Venice, with the possible exception of blind old Dandolo, who was responsible for the sack of Constantinople in 1204, with that possible exception, the only doge with any touch of personality or legend about him is the one, ironically, whose face was cancelled in the Sala del Maggior Consiglio, Marino Faliero. And in both these cases, Dandolo and Faliero, much of their fame is due to the foreign writer Byron. Byron wrote about Dandolo in Childe Harold, and he wrote a play about Marino Faliero. It's interesting to note, in fact, that in his travel poem, Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, which is where he mentions Dandolo, when he talks of Florence, he mentions Michelangelo, Galileo, Machiavelli, Dante, and when he talks of Rome, he mentions Caesar, Brutus, Cicero, Livy, but when he talks about Venice, apart from Dandolo, he mentions essentially Othello and Shylock. The most famous Venetians, you might say, for at least as far as Byron is concerned, are literary inventions, literary characters. So, as I say, it's not until the 18th century that Venetian figures emerge from that general fog of anonymity, and none, of course, more strongly than Casanova. And the very fact that he appears so strikingly tells us that things have changed in Venice. And the main change is that Venice is no longer important on the world stage. It doesn't count in military terms, it doesn't count in political terms, or even in commercial terms. It no longer holds the gorgeous East in fee, as Wordsworth would put it after the definitive fall of the city. So here are Venetian possessions in the year 1500. Okay, they're the blue ones that, as you can see, go all the way down the Adriatic Sea towards Crete and the Ionian Sea. And these are the possessions on which Venice's great trade network was based. They relied on having these possessions for their trade to continue, their trade that had made Venice so rich. So if we jump forward a couple of centuries to 1700, you can see that those possessions have dwindled. There's still the Peloponnese at the bottom there, but they would soon lose that. In 1716, the Venetians managed to drive off a Turkish invading force that was trying to take over their most important island, their most important remaining island, Corfu. But that was the last military action of the city. In 1718, the Peace of Passarowitz was signed between Venice, Austria, and the Ottoman Empire, the Turks. And from then on, Venice remained entirely marginal, uninvolved in all the major conflicts of the century, the War of Austrian Succession, the 7 Years' War, until Napoleon put an end to the Venetian Republic in 1797. So Casanova was born into this now marginal city in 1725. Venice was now a kind of empty shell, though a splendidly beautiful shell. So here is a painting by Canaletto, the 18th century painter who basically immortalized the splendor of Venice in that century, mainly for foreigners, mainly for tourists, and specifically for English grand tourists. And it's a city that had long been pulling in tourists. So tourists didn't begin in the 18th century. We can see that if we look at Shakespeare's play As You Like It. Here is Rosalind addressing the character Jaques, who's declared his intention of going off to become a traveller, and she bids him farewell, rather ironically, in these lines. Farewell, Monsieur Traveller, look you lisp and wear strange suits, disable all the benefits of your own country, be out of love with your nativity, and almost chide God for making you that countenance you are, or I will scarce think that you have swam in a gondola. So swimming in a gondola seems to be the symbol of what it means to be a traveller or a tourist. If you're going to travel, you have to go to Venice. And it's notable that Shakespeare could, in The Merchant of Venice, refer casually to the Rialto, knowing that his audience would understand what he meant by that, just as everybody today knows what Wall Street means, even if you've not been to New York. So, everybody knew Venice, and they knew its splendid sights, its spectacles, and the greatest spectacle of all was this one here, the Ascension Day festival. This was the biggest feast day of the year, in which the Doge set out on his magnificent state barge, the Bucintoro, which you can see there on the right in that painting, to go and wed Venice to the sea. So the Doge would throw a ring into the Adriatic Sea, this symbol of Venetians' marriage with the sea. This, of course, was becoming an increasingly empty ceremony, because Venice, you might say, had long been cuckolded by the Turks, and not only the Turks. And there's an interesting description of this feast day by Casanova himself. So in 1753, here he is writing about the Bucintoro. The next morning, I masked early, because this took place, as I say, on this feast day, and so feast days were associated with the carnival spirit of the carnival notion of dressing up and putting on a mask. So I masked early to follow the Bucentaur, which, as the day was fair, was to go to the Lido without fail. This function, which is not only unusual but unique, depends upon the courage of the Admiral of the Arsenal, since he must answer for the weather remaining fair on peril of his head. The least contrary wind could capsize the vessel and drown the Doge, with the whole Serenissima Signoria, the ambassadors, and the nuncio of the Pope, founder and guarantor of the efficacy of this strange sacramental ceremony, which the Venetians rightly revere to the point of superstition. The crowning misfortune of such a tragic accident would be that it would set all Europe laughing and saying that the Doge of Venice had finally gone to consummate the marriage. So in some ways, this is symbolic of what Venice had become. The Bucintoro itself was so top-heavy with gilded decorations that the slightest wind, if it actually put out to sea, could overturn it. However, if the weather was good, and so the admiral had the courage enough to give the go-ahead, they put on this dazzling show of the kind the Venetians had always been good at giving, and of the kind that Casanova himself would give throughout his life. But in Casanova's case, it's an entirely personal affair. The show he puts on is not for the glory of the city, it's for the glory of himself. It's a one-man show which he took on the road throughout Europe. And in this too, Casanova is typical of the age. As the English biographer Ian Kelly put it, it was very fashionable to be Venetian. So it was no surprise that Casanova lived most of his life outside Venice. You can get an example of this if you just look at where a number of the great Venetians of the 18th century died. Okay, so here are a few Venetian deaths in the 18th century. Antonio Vivaldi, the composer, died in Vienna. Giambattista Tiepolo, the greatest painter of the age, died in Madrid. Bernardo Bellotto, who was the nephew of the great view painter Canaletto, and was also a view painter himself, died in Warsaw. Carlo Goldoni, the playwright, died in Paris. And then we come to Casanova's own family. His mother, who was an actress, died in Dresden. And his two brothers, both painters, one of them died in Austria, and the other died, like their mother, in Dresden. So the point is, people wanted Venetian art. They wanted Venetian theatre, they wanted Venetian music. Casanova himself wasn't a professional actor, but he was a performer, and he was always very close to the world of the theatre. It's interesting that the best biographer of Casanova in English, Ian Kelly, is in fact an actor himself, and so feels a kind of special rapport with his subject. So Casanova was the son of actors. He himself actually did perform as a musician, a violinist, early in his life, and he frequented and had affairs with actresses and singers and dancers. Their names are scattered throughout the memoirs. And he really turned his whole life into a performance. Perhaps the most famous performance he put on was his account of his escape from the prison of the Doge's palace. And this became a one-man stage show, which he was forever repeating and embellishing until it actually became 2 hours long. And he would not perform it unless he was guaranteed 2 hours to tell the whole story. He was always dressing up, and occasionally cross-dressing, and of course frequently undressing. And his seduction episodes in his memoirs are always presented like little scenes in a play. And he thought of his whole life as a play. Here, for example, is what he had to say in London when he was at a particularly low ebb. This was in 1763. And he considers himself as having reached the end of the first act of his life. Such was the state to which the god of love brought me in London nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita. It's very typical of Casanova to be quoting from Dante, the first line of the Inferno, in the middle of the journey of our life. Nel mezzo del cammin di nostra vita at the age of 38. It was the end of the first act of my life. The second, of course he's writing at the very end of his life, the second closed on my departure from Venice in 1783. The third will apparently close here, where I am amusing myself writing these memoirs. Okay, so he's writing it towards the end of his life in Bohemia. The comedy will then have ended, and it will have had 3 acts. If it is hissed, I hope that I shall not hear anyone tell me so. So the last act was a melancholy one. He actually outlived the Venetian Republic by 1 year. He died in 1798. The Republic fell in 1797. And this final act is part of the legend, the libertine in old age. He's not carried off to hell, as Don Giovanni was. He's left just with his memories. He was living, as I say, in Bohemia, in this castle. He was working as a librarian for Count von Waldstein. He worked there from 1784 until his death. I don't think his librarian duties were very onerous. He spent most of his time writing. He couldn't speak German or Czech. He was a good linguist. He wrote his memoirs entirely in French, and that was, of course, the international language of the age. But he never learned German or Czech, so he was cut off from any possible audience there. He had always been a talker. Another thing was, as he mentions in the memoirs, he had lost his teeth at this point. So even if he could talk to, for example, Prince de Ligne, who was a friend of his who occasionally visited, even if he could talk, he couldn't actually put on the kind of performance that he had done throughout his life. So what did he do? He wrote, and he wrote, and he wrote. And it's his writings that made him famous. But it's important to point out that it is mostly posthumous fame. In his lifetime, he acquired a certain name for himself. He became notorious, but he would never have become the legend that he did without the Histoire de ma vie, the story of my life. And that wasn't published until a quarter century after his death. In his own lifetime, his two brothers, Francesco and Giovanni, were actually far more famous as painters. In fact, when he met the Empress Catherine, she says to his chagrin, "Ah, you're the brother of the painter." Francesco Casanova was born in London in 1727, perhaps the son of the Prince of Wales. There is this rumour, the son of the Prince of Wales, who then became George II. So their actress mother was then working in London. He spent much of his life in Paris, then he went to Vienna. He won the approval of Diderot, but he died in poverty, unfortunately. Whereas the younger brother, Giovanni, was far more successful. He was taken up by the painter Anton Raphael Mengs. He became the director of the Academy of Dresden. So Casanova has contacts with famous people, like, for example, Mengs. He frequents them, he describes him, though they rarely mention him. So, as I say, he ended up in this forgotten corner of Bohemia, taken on as a librarian by this Joseph Karl Emanuel von Waldstein, who was a fellow Freemason with an interest in magic, and Casanova sometimes pretended to have magic powers. He received visits from, for example, the Prince de Ligne, who I've already mentioned, where they could talk about the good old days. But otherwise, he had no company he could talk with. He was despised by the servants, the other servants, as we might put it. So he wrote, and he wrote, and he wrote. He paid occasional visits to Prague. In 1787, it's possible that in Prague he met Mozart. He was renewing his acquaintance with the Mozart's librettist Lorenzo da Ponte, and he possibly contributed. There is this story that he may have contributed to the libretto of Mozart's opera Don Giovanni, a subject, of course, that Casanova would have found particularly appealing. But when he was in Dux in Bohemia, as I say, he spent most of his time just writing. The first piece of writing that actually acquired a certain amount of fame was the account of his escape from the leads, from the prison in the Doge's palace. This was a story he told over and over. Now he couldn't actually perform it, so he put it down in writing. And it came out in 1787. He also published a 3-volume proto-science fiction novel, Icosameron, which was a financial failure. And in 1790, he began telling the story of his life. Ian Kelly says he actually became addicted to writing. And then he, as I say, he died in 1798, not having completed his memoirs. He died weakened by at least 11 bouts of venereal disease, and also by the mercury that was then used to treat this disease. And his last words, allegedly in this armchair, were, they say, "I have lived as philosopher and die as a Christian." So I've spent all this time talking about the end of Casanova's life because that is where the fame and legend began. He left his papers to a nephew, the husband of his sister's daughter, and their descendants sold it in 1821 to a German publisher, Brockhaus of Leipzig. It was finally published in a bad German translation, heavily abridged, and it was denounced from the pulpit and placed on the Vatican's Index of Prohibited Books, which certainly helped its notoriety. And then a French translation, a pirated French translation, came out of the German. So the memoirs which had been originally written in French were translated into German and then translated back into French. And at this point, Brockhaus realized that this was ridiculous. And so Brockhaus commissioned a local professor, Jean Laforgue, to bring out the definitive French edition of Casanova's story of my life. However, it proved to be far from definitive. It was heavily Bowdlerized. Jean Laforgue took it upon himself to correct Casanova's French, which is sometimes rather Italianate. He introduced passages. Laforgue was an anti-clerical Republican, so he cut most of Casanova's declarations of his Christian faith. He toned down his remarks on the French Revolution. And this work appeared between 1826 and 1838 and was accepted as authoritative until the 1960s. The most popular English translation by the writer Arthur Machen, which you can find for free on the internet, is a translation of Laforgue. That is to say, it's not a bad translation, but it's a translation of a bad text. Laforgue returned the manuscript to Brockhaus, though 4 chapters were missing, and so those chapters we only have Laforgue's version. And for over 100 years, people read this edition, and Casanovites or Casanovists started checking up on the historical accuracy of his stories, identifying characters, and the legend grew and grew. Everybody knew about Casanova, and everybody was reading him, sometimes even rather surprising people. For example, the very serious English art historian John Ruskin describes in a letter to an American friend his routine while he was studying Carpaccio's cycle of paintings about Saint Ursula, which are now in the Accademia in Venice. And Ruskin writes, "I strike work at 2 or a little after, go home and read letters, and dine at 3, lie on sofa, and read any vicious book I can find to amuse me, to prevent St. Ursula having it all her own way. I'm greatly amused with the life of Casanova at the moment." I find this rather astonishing. He's the last person I would have thought of as being amused by the life of Casanova. And it throws a new light, you might say, on John Ruskin. Between 1960 and 1962, a new edition was finally produced, based on Casanova's text and not Laforgue's. And people began to appreciate Casanova as a writer. They actually appreciated the quality of his writing, even if his French was occasionally a little Italianate. That actually was a kind of, it added an extra flavour. Between 1967 and 1971, the American translator Willard Trask brought out this edition in 12 volumes. And that is still the standard edition in English. In 2010, the manuscript was finally purchased by the Bibliothèque Nationale of France for around 7 million euros. And a new French edition was brought out, a new 3-volume edition by Jean-Christophe Higuelon and Éric Leboyne. So, the story of how the legend grew, how the writings reached us. I mean, there was no guarantee that these memoirs would actually get out into the world. They could easily have just been thrown into the fire. So there's something haphazard about it all. And in some ways that's fitting, for Casanova's life was governed by chance. It's a gambler's life. Casanova was a gambler, sometimes, you might say, a professional gambler. And the story, the way he recounts the story, you can see just how important chance is to him. Here, for example, in Volume 3, he says, "These are the beautiful moments of my life, these happy encounters, unforeseen, unexpected, completely fortuitous, due to pure chance, and all the dearer for that." The memoirs are often similar, not surprisingly, to the great novels of the 18th century. If I confine myself to British examples, I might mention Tom Jones or Pamela, a novel that Casanova certainly read, Clarissa, Tristram Shandy, and the works of Smollett. And these novels typically have a huge cast of characters, and some of them will disappear for long stretches, only to turn up unexpectedly later in the story. In a few cases, like for example Tom Jones, the novels are very closely plotted, but most often their storylines seem to owe a great deal to pure chance and serendipity. And this, of course, is the case of Casanova's life. The woman that Casanova probably loved the most, a mysterious Frenchwoman known as Henriette, whom he fell in love with between 1749 and 1750, famously left a message in the window of an inn in Geneva. Tu oublieras aussi Henriette. You will forget Henriette too. Casanova, returning to Geneva 13 years later, found these words still there, and apparently they were still visible a century later. But of course the whole point is that he doesn't forget Henriette. Casanova forgets nothing. No, I have not forgotten her, and it is balm to my soul every time I remember her, when I consider that what makes me happy in my present old age is the presence of my memory. I conclude that my long life must have been more happy than unhappy. And after thanking God, cause of all causes and sovereign contriver, we know not how, of all combinations, I congratulate myself. So, as I say, he forgets nothing and he omits nothing. Even things that most people would be embarrassed to put down about themselves. There's a comparison, of course, with Rousseau, who also told everything and spared himself no blushes. And Casanova sometimes makes the comparison with Rousseau, always to the detriment of Rousseau. But Casanova has no moralistic aim, unlike Rousseau. The memoir is purely intended to cheer himself up in his old age. He is indulging himself in these memories, and he is trying to entertain himself, and therefore to entertain also us, the readers. And it works. We're often shocked, we often disapprove, but we can't stop reading. So I'd like to conclude this first part of my talk with a poem by the British poet Dick Davis. It's a short poem, but I think it's a perfect encapsulation of what it is about Casanova's life that continues to fascinate us. There are two words that might need a little explanation. Bobby Dazzler in line 6 is a Geordie term for a person with a smart dress sense, and the adjective braw that precedes the word Bobby Dazzler is Scottish for fine and pleasing. So here are Dick Davis's lines on Casanova. Conman extraordinaire, grand Kabbalist, whose angels spell out Leporello's list, Antaeus, who draws strength from touching hearts, and better guarded, more lubricious parts, shapeshifter, trickster, miracle producer, braw Bobby Dazzler, all the world's seducer, commoner, snob, suave crony at the palace, ruled only by your own unruly phallus. High on the Doge's roof you slip, flail, crawl, but our appalled applause won't let you fall. Elsewhere, Dick Davis has described Casanova's memoirs in these terms. Imagine Boswell rewritten by Rabelais, or Cellini's chutzpah and braggadocio forcibly coupled with Smollett's relish for lowlife and adventure. And so we end with that word, adventure. The most recent biography of Casanova by Leo Damrosch uses the word adventure as its title. The memoirs are an adventure story, or a story of adventures, plural. And if they're not exactly uplifting, they're always damnably entertaining. I would say they provide highly suitable reading for Carnival.